Hey, listeners. Just wanted to note that this podcast episode was recorded a while ago in summer 2020 and that it contains minor spoilers for Ursula K. Le Guin's The Other Wind and Cory Doctorow's For the Win. Happy listening.
Hey, everybody. So we're here today, and I think Ben and I were hoping to talk about how we go, sort of, I don't know, how we find our subject matter is as writers is, I think, where I'm approaching this, because I think initially, and I see this a lot with my students, they don't know what to write about. And even like my daughter is drawing, right? She's more of an artist. And she and I were thinking we would do a summer project of working on like making some fabric designs. And I was like, I have, I'm almost 50 and I have gazillion things that I know I want to work on. And so for me, it's a matter of narrowing it down at this point and honing and refining and picking the most exciting project. But for her, she's a little lost. Like there's a whole world of possibility. And I was like, well, what do you like drawing? And she's like, I don't know. I don't know what I like drawing. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe that's what we need to figure out. What do you like drawing? Right. So for writers, what I see with my students is similar, that they come into the classroom and they're so grateful when I have exercises for them, right? Because it gives them a focus, an assignment, and like, okay, I want you to do a scene with two people in a beach or a kitchen, and they should be, one of them is trying to teach the other one something. You need to convey this piece of information, but not have it sound like an info dump, embedded in a conversation between them, and there must be conflict, right? And like, boom, I then give them 20 minutes to write, and they come up with 15 great examples of this, right? So I guess
constraints creativity is born of constraints very often. I mean, I think that it's often very salutary.
Right. So, but when I do that, it is also kind of random. So I feel like there's a moment, right? I mean, you could hear how random that was. That's a pretty good exercise. I recommend it to everyone. But if you, at some point, you have to be like, well, I've written 25 different stories that are kind of like not connected to each other, or, and when we think about like writers finding their voice, some of that is prose style, but also there's like finding your themes, right? Like, what is it that you want to write about? So so I don't know, when you first started writing, like, were there topics you came back to over and over again?
Well, I do remember it being, that is the most common question, right? Is this sort of when young writers are asking, where do you get your ideas? Like, that is sort of a what should I write about question, right? I think it's framed differently. It's interesting how it's framed differently in the literary world and the science fiction world, because the literary world is like, I think there's a natural presumption that you're going to be writing about, autobiography, or like, your grandmother dying of cancer.
Well, you're going to write about people in relationships, right?
Right. But also, like, in some sense that it's rooted in, like, more directly rooted in your own experience, not necessarily far afield. I don't know. Like, I mean, you look incredulous.
Well, I mean, I don't know if that's an assumption. I think it's true that a lot of my beginner writers do that, but you also have lots of writers who do historicals and, like, who are doing war stories and so on,
you had
right?
said when you're teaching and people come and they're like doing science fiction, you're like, well, that's, you need training wheels, you're learning this thing, it's hard to do science fiction at the same time. You don't have that reaction if someone says, I'm going to write about 6th century Dark Ages England? You're like, oh, that's a breeze, go for it. Like, really? Because that requires the same degree of like world building and intentional thinking about how the world is set up. And
I don't think it's the same degree. I still think the science fiction problem is harder, because you have to invent, you can research for the historical, right? And so, and like for my historical, I'm hoping we're going to get to talking about that, if not this episode, then a later one. Like, my novel and story starts in Sri Lanka in the 1940s, and I did some research, right? But it was a process of uncovering as opposed to a process of invention, which I find invention much harder personally, and that
may
just be
that's very
me.
interesting.
Yeah,
that's very interesting because in the beginning of my career, I always had sort of an attraction to historical fiction, but in the beginning of my career, there was no way I was going to go there because invention was so much easier than research. Because from my point of view, when I was starting out, it was like if I get to make the rules, like if I get to just decide, then like it's not. I mean, I guess I sort of started out in one of two modes, right? The sort of science fictional, like hard science fictional mode is like, well, this will be an extrapolation. So then I need to do some thinking. But usually it's drawing on things I knew about already or whatever. And like to the extent that I needed to go check the equations, you know what I mean? Like that's seemed like more of a manageable problem. Like maybe there'll be a physics word problem buried in this story somehow, but like then I can ask somebody and I can tease it out.
Sure.
Where it's not like every teacup and every hem length and every like literally everything visible on the screen could just be wrong, and it's actually wrong, and somebody who knows the history would know that it was wrrong.
No,
and
I see what you're saying. Yeah, no,
because I can make the hem lengths whatever I want if it's the 25th century. Maybe I'll make some error about like time space or something, like if I'm trying to do hard science fiction, but like I can literally make up any clothes I want. Nobody can tell me I'm wrong about the 25th century, right?
And I do think like in my 20s, I found invention easier than I do now, right?
Yeah.
So, and I see this with like my son. If he and I are hanging out, we're doing a role-playing game together and we need some monsters, he can just like spin off monster after monster after monster. This one's 20 feet tall, this one is blah blah blah, and throw all these details on. I have a much harder time with that than he does, and I think I get decision fatigue as part of what's happening, right? Like it's like I don't know, there's a bunch of weight to like every decision, and I'm like, well, if I make 20 feet tall, then that's going to mean this and this and this and this and this, right? And like, what's this? And he doesn't care, right?
Right.
Anand is like, oh, whatever. The point is we're going to have a great battle here, right? So,
and I think that's for one thing, that's very dependent on genre, because if you're writing like as I was saying, I had sort of had two modes, one of which was sort of more like rigorous and the other sort of more absurdist. Like if I'm writing absurdist whimsy, really, I don't, it can be 20 foot tall and speak in a squeaky voice and like float around like a marshmallow. I don't know, like it's fine, and I mean, that's in a way the easiest for me, in the sense that constraints are entirely self-imposed, and I'm not gonna, the easiest at banishing my editor brain that is like, maybe this is wrong. Right. Whereas historical fiction, I have the most load of like, is this wrong? Maybe this is wrong. Maybe I'm misrepresenting. Maybe people are out there who actually know that they wouldn't have, like, that the sword would be curved and not straight. Like, and I'm getting that wrong. Like that.
I think that's partly is that you and I, like, I don't really do the whimsy, surrealist kind of absurdist mode that you talk about. Like, I love Italo Calvino. Your work, some of your work reminds me of Italo Calvino's work. And
I mean, and no accident, I literally wrote a series of cities. I mean,
yes. So for people who haven't read, Calvino is brilliant. If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, I recommend to anyone interested in plot. The Baron in the Trees is a fabulous absurdist novel, but the particular one, I get yours and his confused. So his was
his is Invisible Cities.
His was Invisible Cities, which is a traveler coming back to Marco Polo, coming back to the Khan to tell him about these city after city that he visited, and each one is a fabulous invention, very short, like a couple pages. And yours was.
So mine is called Other Cities, and it's sort of a pastiche. A lot of it was more science fictional or fantastical, but like basically, little snapshots. And I mean, that was actually the first thing, as we remarked on earlier, the first thing I published. Second thing I sold, first thing I published. And they were very Calvino, little Borges in there, and very much like thought experiments. And like a whole bunch of them do not have any named characters, do not have any, some of them have a little bit of plot, but a lot of times the plot is more like the plot of a historical essay, like this is how this city developed from the 19th to the 21st centuries, rather than being like a person does a thing. So I mean,
and that's a little what I'm trying to, I think, get at. So that Other Cities published at Strange Horizons, you can go read it online right now. Per our previous episode, this is one of the great things about online fiction is that it makes it really easy to do that. But I guess the point is, and this leads into me being at Clarion, so which was going to be a later episode, but we'll get there. But the specific thing that I ended up having a huge problem with at Clarion is that I came in having learned pretty well how to write realist mainstream fiction. Like, I mean, I was in an MFA program. I'm not saying I was brilliant, but like I knew that mode, and I could.
You were brilliant.
Haha, I could execute it. You know, like I was reading Alice Munro and being, you know, blown away by her at that point, and so that was what I was aiming towards, right? And then I came to Clarion and was, you know, which I was so excited to do, and to write science fiction fantasy, which I loved. And I wrote these, and each week, you know, we'd have a prompt of some kind. Sometimes, like, I think Michael Bishop required that we write a hard science fiction story one week, which we all groaned in misery. Not all of us, but many of us. And but it was a good exercise. And there were, you know, Chip Delaney gave us some specific thing he wanted us to try to do. And my stories mostly didn't work. And I would say they were very thin. And for me, they didn't feel real, right? And so and I don't think this is true of everybody, but for me, learning to write good science fiction and fantasy was a long process of learning how to marry all of the world building and invention and everything you can do with that with my realist fiction skills. So that, you know, if you read my genre fiction now, it reads like realist fiction, right? It's not whiz bang or absurdist or anything, you know, like it just, you know, it's like, yes, you are now having a family relationship squabble that happens to be in the middle of an interstellar war with aliens, and not just happens to be, because I do try and make the science fictional component integral, right? So there is that extrapolation element, but it's usually a social extrapolation, right? Like, what if, you know, I don't know, like in my story Webs, for example, it's essentially kind of a trans story. And I was trying to think about, well, what if we get to a point where trans surgeries and, you know, the process to switch gender is very, very good, right?
Yeah.
What issues might you still run into at that point, right? Like what would be, so okay, I'm just babbling now, but I don't know. Can I bring this back to theme? So we were talking about finding our topics.
We should say probably the process to express your underlying gender. What is anyway. Yeah, go.
Well, yeah.
Sure.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to derail you.
Well, I guess no. Well, I'll just say, like, I think in that story, I you know, it is in the future, it's on another planet, and it's not the same conversation too that we're having now, right? So I think I was drawing a little bit also on things like John Varley and like these earlier ideas of like, what if gender transformation was easy? So
also Trouble on Triton.
Yeah, so it not necessarily the same conversation that trans people are having today about expressing an underlying gender. It could be more, you know.
I say this partly because in the Unraveling, of course, that's a major premise of the Unraveling, is that changing your genitals and you know, body shape in general is so simple that they no longer even associate it with gender. That's not what gender is about for them.
Right.
You can go have whatever genitals you like. That's not very important. Let's talk about your gender, which is about, you know, introversion and extroversion or some other things. But something that I will say that it, like, between the, I don't know, you know, 7th and 8th draft of it, I mean, I did think about what that meant in terms of the current conversation. I mean, over the 10 years that I was writing the book, the conversation also definitely evolved, and I got more educated about trans issues, and I wanted not to tie it to the current conversation in a superficial way so that it sounded like these are 21st century, you know, people speaking through, and I'm just parroting, because it's a vastly different context, but at the same time to sort of be rigorously honest about, and it's only ended up being a few lines that you could blink in if you miss it, but I think there were a couple of like things that I definitely changed to make, because I think also the notion that there's this thing out of the Varley and Delaney, the sort of 70s feminist, you know, people who were talking about the sort of frictionless fluidity of transforming your expressed sexual, what you looked like on the outside, and how you wake up as a woman, right? And I feel like there is a way in which that both was liberatory at the time and also now kind of potentially trivializes something. Like reading Julia Serrano, Whipping Girl, where it's kind of like, it's not, by making it sort of like, gender, whatever. It's like, there's some real like stickiness to lived experience of like, and so, I wanted to, so there's just a little one-liner throwaway where one character's like, oh, so you just made all their genitals match? And the other character's like, no, like, genitals aren't hats. You can be made miserable by the wrong set of genitals. Like it's very important, but it's they just no longer hang gender on that. But like there's still self-concept and body. It was like I kind of had to tease apart gender identity as an ideology and physical dysphoria and like the match between you and your body, and like there's a bunch of different things going on there. And I wanted to shuffle the deck, but I also wanted to, I don't know. It's just.
Well, I think
we're far afield. You wanted to talk about how we pick our subject matter.
I think it's coming around actually, because like here we are both talking about genders, and so it'll wrap around like, why did we both end up writing about gender? In some sense? So, but I guess I'll say one thing, which is for webs, even though I'm cisgendered and it's not really a story about trans issues or about the process of going through transition or anything like that, but that is embedded within the story. So I did end up, like, I passed it by some trans friends of mine, and they can't guarantee that I'm not going to get anything wrong, but I did want to avoid the obvious pitfalls at any rate, right? So I think that's, even if you're working on a somewhat different project, I think there's a value to that. Of not casually hurting people out of your ignorance, and right.
And so, I mean, this is a deep topic. We should definitely talk about like sensitivity readers and like writing the other and all that stuff, and also just like because I think there's a like you. And just the issue of moral responsibility for your work and how it lands, and the difference in impact and intent. But I feel like I feel like I both think that there's a really useful toolkit that's emerged for like how can you engage with like how you're affecting other people's experience. And there's all this conversation out there where people see this as like a burdensome, annoying due diligence process. You know what I mean? Like, I wrote my beautiful thing, and like now I have to like make sure it doesn't offend anybody. You know what I mean? And it feels like that's such a lost opportunity to see it as this enrichment of your project. You know what I mean?
There's a great essay about that in, I want to say, Wisconsin Chronicles 5, maybe. There's I can't remember offhand which volume it's in, but there's a comic artist who sort of shows some panels, talks about realizing there was a problem, going back in, doing the research, and then the sort of concrete specifics on how it made her work so much better the second time around.
And I feel like there's this useful conversation to have about broadening the frame to where it's not like, oh, there are these special groups with special sensitivities and you don't want to step on their toes, and therefore there's a checklist of like who you should check in with that you're not doing anything wrong, which is a problem. And that's like one very limited framing of it. The other way to look at it is like, you literally never know what you wrote. You come up with this idea that, well, I wrote this beautiful thing. No, you don't know. The book only, the story that you wrote is something that happens in the reader's head. Differently in every reader's head. You only wrote half the story, and every single reader is going to add their other half. And like the whole process of like critiquing and engaging with people, the whole interesting richness of it is figuring out what the hell people read when you wrote your story. So it's and really that's like and the idea of not the specific and important special case of not hurting people around like historical oppressions, which is very important, is like just one general part of the fact that you really need to take account of what story the people are reading in their head. You know what I mean? And so I don't know. It's just like, anyway. So
yes, so we'll come back to this. We're gonna I made a note. We'll do a topic. We'll do a session just on this, and then we can talk about like all the ways we've gone wrong. I had one terrible, like one of my first stories. Made huge missteps in this regard. So,
So
that's
good. should have a whole series of mistakes episodes, I think.
We should have a series of mistakes episodes. So what we did here is Ben and I had both been going to conventions, just to recap, going to conventions, we'd met each other, we'd both published some, and we'd been in critique groups. So, which I think we haven't talked about a lot yet, but it's a pretty standard part of being a fiction writer. Most people, I think at some point, end up doing crit groups to more and less utility, depending on how well they're structured. And also like what you're looking for at a given point in your work and your writing, and also are the people in the group the right people to be giving you feedback on this. So it's a complicated thing, but you had found some use out of them and I had found some use out of them, and we got to.
And I should say, I mean, this sort of ties back to something we said earlier, that was one of the big surprises for me, was how communal and like how collegial and communal an enterprise it was, how it wasn't me sitting alone in a garret, producing great truths, but that really, like, in some sense, I mean, yes, critique groups can go terribly wrong, and sometimes they're boring, and sometimes the wrong thing, and they can be destructive and all that, but like also like really a huge part of the enterprise of writing. I feel like a lot of times that's really where my stories came alive, is once I could get a hold of what other people were reading when I wrote stuff, and and they were just an indispensable part of the process.
Yeah, I love critique. I love getting the feedback. I think partly it's a little bit like when you publish a story, sometimes it goes out into the world and you don't know if anyone's ever read it aside from the editor, right? Yeah. So the critique group, at least you're like, here are 12 people who are locked down and have to read this story of mine and tell me what they think of it. So that's very
and also I take this enormous pride in stories that I have critiqued. Like I'm sort of, if my stories are my children, the stories I've critiqued are my godchildren. You know what I mean? Like they'll end up, like, I don't know, the life cycle of software objects will end up on the Nebula Ballad or whatever. I'll be like at least as excited as if my own story is there, because, or no, not like more uncomplicatedly excited. Let's put it that way. Like my story is like, oh God, now I gotta pressure or whatever. And if I've critiqued the story and it does well, I'm just like, oh yay, my baby.
That's very sweet. I don't know if I have that sense. I guess maybe a little bit. If I made a fundamental change, like if something I said really affected the story, then I definitely have that. Like, okay, so I'm going to take a step back because I realized I want to talk about the oeuvre crit, but to do that, I want to talk about what I thought I was writing about before that. We were both, I think, about 10 years into our careers when we decided to do this thing we call the oeuvre crit, something like that.
Maybe.
I think so, because I have this 10-year figure in my head. So I get interviewed. I got interviewed a lot early on, and people would ask me why I wrote about sex, right? Because in my first several years of writing, I was writing erotica, and it was making my parents and a lot of other people in the South Asian community very unhappy, and I got a lot of hostility. I was at a party with writers once in Philly in the early 90s, and this journalist said, you write about sex, you write erotica, are you a nymphomaniac? And it was just like, so it was a fascinating moment. This is back when you couldn't walk into a bookstore and buy erotica. This was, the Susie Bright's Best American Erotica series had just started, so on. So people would ask me so why do you write about this? You seem like a nice, normal Catholic girl, why
are you writing about dirty, dirty things?
Ex-Catholic girl, but I would say ex-Catholics probably do quite a lot of that. But what I would say is that, look, I'm Sri Lankan American. My parents expected me to have an arranged marriage. I grew up here and dated, which they hated. So the biggest source of conflict in my life was around dating and sex and marriage. Yeah. And as a writer, I think we go where the conflict is. And so that's what I ended up writing about. That was clearly these are the things that needed to be worked out in some way, and that I was frustrated with how they were in the real world. And so writing was, sometimes I say writing is therapy in a somewhat, it's not really therapy, but it can be therapeutic, right? So it's not, it doesn't map completely onto therapy. But I think for me, I often do write to figure out what I really think about something, right? Yeah. So whether that's writing a post on Facebook right now about like, should we send the kids back to school in the fall, and what are all of the factors that go into that? I often don't know when I start writing exactly what I think about it until I do it. And it's true for fiction as well. So I think it's fair to say in my 20s, I knew what my themes were. My themes were around sexuality and conflict with family and the silences that surround sex, the damage that gets done by not talking about it. But by the time I was about 30, I had been writing that stuff for 10 years, and I was kind of done. I'd hit a point of like, I feel like I've said everything I have to say, and I don't know what I'm going to write about next, right? It was, and this was kind of somewhere around there was also when I was starting the PhD program and starting to work on Bodies in Motion. Like this was all, we should go back and figure out when exactly we did the Overcrit, but it was somewhere in that time period, I think. So, and I think I proposed this to you, that we get together and instead of just critiquing one story, we read everything.
Was that your idea? And how did the idea come up? Like what was the...
I think I wanted it, like I was feeling the need to like look at everything I'd done and figure out like, what is it that I have done? What is it that I should be doing next? I was a little lost, right?
What year do you think this was? Because I have this memory that
is it earlier? Is it?
No, I think it might. I mean, I have this memory that it was related. I mean, there's sort of two things that happened. I don't know when they happened and to what extent they were parallel or whatever. But these two efforts of like pulling together everything I'd ever written and chipping it off. One of which was to you, and the other of which was to Kelly and Gavin to figure out what my first collection would be. And I sort of have this feeling like they were in parallel, or that like the Overcrit was a little beforehand. You know what I mean? Like,
it may have
that
been
would make it like
earlier.
2006, 2007, maybe. I don't know, like, but it couldn't have been that. Maybe it can't be that early.
I think we.
Yeah, because I think only. Anyway, whatever. We'll have to figure this out.
When you're old kids, dates are hard.
I don't know if I can blame my advancing senility. I think I was always a mess around dates.
Well, but I mean, in the fact that like, well, surely I was just in grad school yesterday, but no, that was 20 years ago.
Right.
Like
right. Oh yeah.
So
yes,
I want to say we did it around 2000. So that's
2000. We met in 2000. So no, it can't be that. It can't be around 2000.
Like 2002, like not too far off from that, but anyway.
Yeah, maybe.
Anyway, maybe 2003. So we did this thing where we packed up all of our stuff, emailed it to each other, gave each other a couple of months to read it. It was a lot of stuff. Maybe.
So I have a May 6, 2010 blog entry that says there's something that Marianne Mohanraj and I did a few WisCons ago that I'd like to popularize this general process. That's fine. 2010.
Okay. 2006, 2007. We're gonna cut all this out because this is super boring for anyone who isn't us.
Yes.
So all right. So so we got all this stuff together and we shipped it off, and it was maybe I want to say like a book and a half's worth of stuff, 2 books worth of stuff, like maybe 200,000 words each max, and committed to read it. And then we were going to meet at the convention, and we set aside, I want to say like 2 3-hour blocks for each of our crits, and then we just like went deep into like, and it was specifically, I think we said like, we were going to be like, what are the themes that you see in this work? What do you see me writing about already? Where do you think I'm maybe not engaging as deeply with some things as I should be? Yeah. Where should I go from here? Like, does that
what's missing? What is like the present absence? What is like the thing that, you haven't steered into? Right.
So do you feel like before that you knew what your themes were, like in your first 10 to 15 years as a writer?
Okay, so 2 things. First, I just want to just before we leave the Overcrit, which we'll come back to, but I just want to say to close that loop that it was amazing, and I miss it actually. And one of the things is you rarely talk in that kind of depth about published work, because often you're critiquing, your stories in progress and they're kind of a mess and whatever. And it's a very different thing to go back and look at like a whole bunch of somebody's completed work and be like, okay, but this is the next thing you need to do.
Yeah.
And I wish writers did that more. We do a lot of the workshopping stories that aren't out yet. I would, I would love to have more conversations about like all the things you've done and where you're going. Like that. It was a very, very deep and really interesting conversation.
It was really
we're
great.
overdue. Let's do it again.
I'm totally up for doing it again. It is labor intensive, right? It's a certain we must now sit down and read 5 books at this point.
Yeah,
right?
At some point you'd have to be selective. I think maybe do a pre-selection of these are the things I want you to read.
Yeah.
Harder in your case than mine because I'm less prolific. But anyway,
no, but I actually would love to. Let me just say, I'd love to do that, even just specifically for the science fiction, because right now I'm trying to put all the jump space stuff together and develop it further as a universe, and it would be great to have your perspective on what's missing from that and so on. So that's actually only 125,000 words of stuff.
There you go. I feel like this is a project that people, I would like to, I'd like to do them more often. I'd like people to do them more often. Anyway, so to back up a minute, when we talk about what are your themes, I do want to back up to connect the issue of that we started talking about what should I write about? How should I, I'm a newbie looking at a blank page, with the idea of, because now you're talking about theme. And as I was saying, there's sort of a lit world and a science fiction world.
Right.
Filter or viewpoint on this or standard narrative. And I think that the literary world, the standard narrative is about theme. Okay, you're this writer, you have recurring themes, obsessions, the things you dwell in, and I feel like that's a little bit different conversation coming out of the genre tradition, where it's you don't necessarily, certainly if you're a literary critic, you would go back and look at Heinlein or Asimov's themes or something. But if you're a practitioner, if you're authors at a bar in BarCon in 1975, you're talking about their future history, their shared universe. They're oh, is it one of the robot stories or is it one of the Foundation stories? Obviously themes in there, but a lot more has to do with constructing elaborate setting, let me construct an elaborate world building concept and or what are your set of ideas that's a little bit different than theme.
But do you think, okay, so
I'm thinking of a theme as loss and an idea as maybe psychohistory. Is that a theme in the same sense? Well, what if humans could predict, a big what if that carries you across multiple books was often an animating feature of. So when genre writers come up and say, what should I write about? They may be looking for you should write about loss and grief and the confronting the darkness in your soul. Or they might be looking about, why don't you write about how cyborg tech,
I'll give you
an idea, because they ask, where do you get your ideas, which is more like a premise.
Yeah, I'll give you a funny example of this.
Yeah.
So John Scalzi, for people who don't know, he's a writer. He was the president of SIFWA at one point. He has this very popular blog, whatever.
A buddy of both of ours.
Yes, friend of both of ours. And at one point he was, this framing is important actually, because he's now doing exceptionally well as a writer. So in the sense of he's written a lot of books. They're very commercially successful, and
you get $1 million deal for 13 books from Tor.
Right, and I think some of them are under development for movies and so on. Right, so he's doing really great now. But a decade or so ago, when was Katrina, Ben? Do you remember the date offhand?
2004.
So it would be within a year or two after Katrina. So around 2005, 2006. So 15 years ago. John was guest of honor at a convention that's local to me. I came out to, you're in town, and met him for lunch. And he had written this piece on his blog called Being Poor, which is brilliant. It is a beautiful, it makes me cry every time I read it. And it was written in the wake of Katrina, and it is essentially a response to all the people who are like, well, why didn't they just leave, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about, and it comes out of his own experience of childhood poverty and
how it limits your choices and
right, etc. And then his piece is great, and then the thread of comments that follows is heartbreaking and brilliant as well. So we had this lunch, and I had read one of his books, and I don't mean to be dismissive of them. I think I'd read Old Man's War, and Old Man's War is the one that kind of like first brought him fame. He self-published it, but then it got picked up, and it was one of the first books that where that had happened. And it was, I would say in part it's because he had this very popular blog, whatever. He had a platform as well, and publishers knew that. So at some point we should have the indie traditional publishing conversation in depth. But so he had written this book, and I liked the book. I enjoyed it. It was a romp, and it was kind of like interesting and fun. But I was like, John, you wrote so incredibly about class and poverty. Why is that not in your fiction? And I kind of pushed him hard in this lunch, a little bit like as if the way I would talk to one of my grad students, right? Like, you know, like this seems very clearly to be a theme that you are deeply invested in. Why are you not writing a novel centering this theme? And he, as far as I know, blithely ignored everything I said then and went on to write things that were fun for him and that have done really well for him, right? And
I mean, and I feel like we should have John on and ask him, but
yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really good book that does really what it wants, and I think that I've talked to him about, he has this and he's publicly said, he has this very specific project and thing he's trying to do, which I think is about and I think he does very well, which is sort of like, and also is definitely conceived as a commercial project. Like it's both, I think, creatively fulfilling for him, and also very much he's like, this is a market niche, which is to take what we loved, I will say about reading Golden Age or Silver Age science fiction that's sort of like adventure in space science fiction, like the delight and thrill and openness of like this universe of discovery and possibility and excitement and drama and exploration and everything that's like was like a sort of the world of Heinlein Juveniles or Dune or whatever, and to do that with this modern sensibility, which is this to do that in a non-reactionary way.
Right. No, and it's really interesting, right? Because I think that's a completely valid aesthetic project, right? Like in terms of like, I could have, but when you talk about how like lit fiction sometimes gets a little focused on theme, it's that it reminds me of that conversand where he was sort of like, I have this aesthetic project I want to do, right? And I was like, but your themes, and he was like,
right, exactly. And that's what I was pointing to, and I was like, well, let's back up from the question of like, did you know what your themes are? Because I do think that's this very literary fiction framing, which is cool, and I'm all about it. I mean, the half of my head that's a literary fiction writer, but it's also like definitely a framing that comes out of this specific historical tradition. And that is a great example of like, screw my themes. Like I want people to read this and be like, this is like Heinlein, except the suck fairy hasn't visited it. You know what I mean? Exactly. Like that's the project. And I mean, he's obviously by lots of measures like hugely successful at that. And yet when you're like, but you clearly care, but it's a very literary fiction question.
I will say, like, I'm still, and I have not, I have a big stack of books to read, and some of his other books are in that stack. So it's just,
this entirely possibly has come around. And
I don't think so, because I've been sort of like, trying to keep an eye on the reviews and so on. And the reviews have been very positive, but they haven't talked about this. I think I'm still waiting for him to marry the two. And I think that might be his like, all-star book, right? Like,
but there's also a possibility that it's in, I mean, again, we have to go back and revisit, but I feel like even in Old Man's War, like,
there was class issues were definitely in there.
It's partly a question of centering. It's partly about like, this book will be about these themes versus like, you can just read this as a romp, but if you look a little underneath it, like why these people are doing it and what has constrained them, and like, why are you giving up your body to be like a green, super soldier in space? Like that, there's these, a lot of it is like a little bit, obliquely or under the hood. And anyway, that's one thing I wanted to, so to return to my own personal experience and to your question, like, did you know what your themes were? I think one of the interesting things is that like, as we said, like I was trying really hard to write literary fiction the way that literary fiction grad students wanted you to write it when I burned out and stopped being a writer.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, I think, was this sort of head-on confrontation with what would be important about this. Like the question, what are you trying to say? What do you uniquely have to say? Which for me was an absolute stopper of a question. You know what I mean?
It's also like super hard when you're 20 to.
Yes, like what the hell would I have to say?
This is not to dismiss 20-year-olds, right? But
no,
you know,
no.
but I mean, just I think there's.
I mean, well, no. I mean, on the contrary, like
it's really pernicious, you know. So my husband's a mathematician, right? Yeah. And it's interesting to see the differences because in math, you are like there's sort of a myth or whatever in math, like no one under 35 has won the Fields Medal for mathematics, or no one over 35, over 35, which is really important. Like there's this kind of like way the grad students talk about like we have to be brilliant now because our brain cells are dying and eventually we won't be able to do genius math.
This did not, however, stop Erdos. One must say, like,
but so,
I'm skeptical, but I'm not a mathematician, so.
But it is very different, and I think you know you see that in like sports, right? Where the body is going to break down eventually, and whatever, right? So there's some fields where it makes a certain sense that there is a youth focus and a if you're going to be a star, you've got to do it before you hit 25 or whatever, right? In fiction, there's no good reason for that, right? We've just sort of like carried it over. It's not like there's any reason why you would suddenly get worse at fiction writing as you get older, right?
Sure, and indeed, I think there's sort of competing romanticisms because there is certainly that literary romantic, like Rimbaud dying in a gutter at 25 or whatever. Like there's that, but there's also this like obviously Le Guin is a badass writing at 80. You know what I mean? If anything, I think there's a certain you know, eminence grise. If you make it to a certain level, you are presumed to be a genius at 80 still.
Right, but there is. You know, there's also like the general youth culture valorization. There's the way that publishers want, you know, ideally you are young and pretty when they send you out on book tour, right? Like all of that.
Well, first of all, they want to make like money for you for many years, and also you need to be pretty in interviews. And like the commercial pressure is definitely
right. So there's a whole bunch of stuff pushing people, and I guess I'm focusing on this a little because it makes me sad in my students because they. Sometimes seem to feel so much anxiety around I have to be brilliant now at 20. I'm like if I don't know what my big great American novel is now, I've already failed as a writer, and that seems to me to speak to like the kind of thing you were feeling back then.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that totally burned me out, the sense that I had to be brilliant. Not necessarily because of, I mean, maybe that was unconsciously implicit, that, you know, the fleeting glory of youth, and that, I mean, to some extent. I think I also had there's this general, this obsession with youth culture is also sort of this general notion that when you're 50, you're going to be like gray and pedestrian and conformist unless you've, you know what I mean? Like you will have lost all your soul. Like don't trust anyone over 30. That's sort of a boomer myth.
And practically speaking, I had a lot more free time at 20 than I do at 50, right? So like, you know, if you end up having kids and parenting and, you know, and if your career gets more demanding, your day job, etc., like, you know, I spent a lot of my early 20s working very mindless, you know, temp secretarial gigs where I just had to answer a phone once an hour and otherwise I'm sitting there writing. I had like so much time to write back then.
But it's funny because a lot of that conversation about free time, it's funny, but like free time, like in a sense, it's like you have the same amount of time. There's still 24 hours in a day. So like it was all the things that make my time unfree are things that on some level, I mean, now, you know, yes, I have to pay for my children to eat. So that, I mean, I'm not saying it's like, yes, there is an actual concrete infrastructural difference between like being, but of course they're 20-year-olds with kids and 50-year-olds without kids. So that's not an inevitability. But like there's some things are distinctly like, I have this mortgage, but on some level, a lot of it is like, and obviously if you're in different class positions, that has a lot of different, like, you know, how many, but for me, like, I, of course, look back with nostalgia, like, oh, I had so few things to do. But partly that was because I had so few things I had decided that I ought to commit to doing. You know what I mean? Like it is a set of choices.
Absolutely, we take it on, but I don't want to skim over this too much because I also want to highlight the gendered aspect as well, right?
Yeah.
And I'm remembering Carol Emshwiller, who passed away recently. Beautiful, brilliant writer. I recommend her novel Carmen Dog as a starting point.
Also, The Mount.
The Mount, all surreal gender explorations, beautiful prose. But she, I was talking to her at WisCon. I think she said this on panels, but we also had conversations about it. And she said that, her husband was a well-known artist. And she said, and he died when she was in her 40s or 50s. And she was sad about that. But at the same time, she said that she essentially couldn't start being a writer until after he died, right? In their house, she talked about how the big open space was his painting studio, right, in the attic or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And everything else was like domestic labor, essentially, right? Like I think they probably had kids and, everything that kind of goes along with that. And there was no, she could maybe write at the kitchen table, and that was, like he was the artist in the house. And I think that dynamic still happens. She's from a generation or two before me, but I certainly still hear that from women writers today, that their male partners do not take their work seriously. And even with me and Kevin, we had this funny moment when we were house hunting, where in our previous condo, he had an office and I worked in our large and spacious living room. I had a little desk set up in the corner, right? But I didn't have a door I could close, and I was sort of okay with it.
I'm just laughing because it's like, although you had read Virginia Woolf.
No, well, this is the thing. It's very much her. What is that line? Like
a room of one's own. Yeah.
A room of one's own, right? Like that. It did not. It wasn't an acute need for me when we were two adults sharing a space. Once we had kids, it became an acute need. And so when we were house hunting, we almost had a fight about this, but we had a kind of like an intense, somewhat distressed conversation where I was like, I have to have my own office in this house. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't it can be a glorified closet, but I got to have an office, which means we have to look for, X many bedrooms, which was going to be a financial strain. Right. And so, but you don't get an office and like we can't have this. And
your turn to write in the living room.
Yeah.
Well, and in the living room.
And he's more isolationist than me, and he's more introverted, and he could not do math in the living room. He would be so miserable. And so I was like, we just have to prioritize this.
That is also a funny gendered thing, though, where we're like, I mean, I believe you couldn't do math in the living room, and I'm terrible about writing with people, depends, but it is interesting how that also worked out in a gendered way, where it's like the Louis C. May Alcotts and the, it's like they're like a whole lot of fiction women wrote was produced with like while like doing a bunch of social and house labor. Anyway,
I'm trying to remember. I think it was Suzette Hayden Elgin who told me about when she was working on her PhD dissertation. She's also a writer, but she's also a linguist, and she came up with this gendered language, Ladan, for women, the women's language, and I'm blanking on the name of the book it's in, but it's a great book. Blanking. Suzette Hayden Elgin, but I think she was writing her dissertation, and she had to take her typewriter, she's also a couple generations older, into the playpen. And that's where she wrote her dissertation. She would let the kids run around outside.
She would be in the playpen.
And she'd be in the playpen writing because it kept your papers safe from the kids. Like that's what they used it for. And I was like, that's amazing. But that's what she had to do in order to get her work done. So anyway, how did we get to this? I lost track of where we.
Okay, so to go back to let's just rewind back to the issue of theme, because that's what I had originally.
I know. So I know. Yes,
go ahead.
I know what my question was for you then. So you don't have to frame it in terms of themes. That's fine.
Well, no,
But wait, you
anyway,
can't.
It's probably more complex than that. But go on.
You can or not. But I guess I want to ask you is like in your first 10 years of writing, both like before and after the start and stop period, right? Like, what was writing for you? Right? Like, what was it that excited you? What brought you to it? What made you want to write?
Right. better question, right? And I think that's sort of what I want to point to about the what should I write about question is very interesting. And the thing that was completely missing for me with that very literary world framing of you achieve greatness by writing about important things that are important. So what are the important things, the truth that only you can tell, which is totally killed, that was a bad question for me.
Right.
Was because what, and the reason I laughed and said it's absurd to ask the 20-year-old that question, it may not be for some 20-year-olds, of course, is not because I don't think that 20-year-olds have a lot to say, because really teenagers younger than 20 create an enormous amount of culture, right? They're the engines of culture creation, right?
Right.
Language, I mean, particularly teenage girls create the words we have. The reason we have different words than Shakespeare is
yeah.
And I mean, there's an enormous amount of really important culture creation that's being done, but it's not this self-conscious process of what do I have to say that's important? I just feel like that's designed to paralyze a teenager, right?
Right.
I do not think that Lil Nas X creating Old Town Road, a revolutionary and very important work of art by a teenager, was motivated. What do I have that's important to say in this moment? I just he thought it would be hilarious to have a rap song about a cowboy.
Yeah.
And I think that spirit of unbridled play and exploration is so much more fruitful for me as a creative stance than so in a way I discovered that I have to sneak up on theme.
Yeah.
If I less so now that I have a little bit more that I have a little bit more slack and experience and self-confidence, but initially it was really useful to think about some cool thing that sounded like it would be awesome, to get to be Calvin, to be an 8-year-old trying to put some go-kart together that would go down the hill with my stuffed tiger, you know what I mean, as opposed and then theme would sneak up. So I don't know, I'm put in mind of A Siege of Cranes. So I wrote a sequel to Siege of Cranes recently, which is coming out this next month in Lightspeed, and in A Siege of Cranes, I wrote when Aviva, 19 years earlier, when Aviva was a baby. I wrote it on paternity leave, mostly with Aviva on my arm, typing one-handed. And the genesis of A Siege, and this is obviously this really important time. But my thought process of writing A Siege of Cranes was, I wrote this little snippet. I wrote this small story called The White City, which was actually going to be one of the other cities, I think, and didn't make the cut, or there was some shuffling around. I said it separately, and I said it to Black Gate, which was a very it still exists and is a old school sensibility, sword and sorcery. I don't know, and they said this needs to be longer, turn this into a whole. And they basically said and it was sort of thinky, and they were we swashbuckling sword and sorcery. And I was so two things I got out of that. The first was they were make this longer, and I was oh, you mean make this shorter, which which is the moment that I realized one of my important writing maxims, which I'll put on the blackboard if I ever get to go teach Clarion, which is the opposite of good critiquing. The opposite of a good critique is usually also a good critique.
Right.
Because so many things in writing are if you're going to bring this up, either deal with it or maybe don't bring it up. Right. You know what I mean? If you are either so it's about choices. So usually make this long, make this darker could be make this lighter, or make this longer could be cut this. Anyway, turned out that 1,000-word story should have really been a 500-word story. But the side effect that I was doing, my first reaction was well, I'm not going to write swashbuckling sword and sorcery. That's not me. And then I was why not? I grew up reading that stuff. I love Moorcock, and why not write I was just that'd just be fun. It'd just be pull stuff out of old RuneQuest campaigns, just monsters and whatever. They'll be. And so I sat down to write just a completely episodic, picaresque, lots of cool monsters, and I would just stitch it together with a plot just as a fun exercise. And I ended up writing this story, which is like deeply about like loss and grief, and like this guy searching for his little baby daughter who's been stolen away with his wife and his entire village. And like it's the most like tragic and like completely channeling like my terror that I was living through as a new father of like being custodian of this vulnerable new life that was like more important to me than my own life. You know what I mean? Like it's completely about, you know, the terror and grief implicit in being a parent. Like that's what the story's about. But I don't think I would have ever written it if I'd sitting down and now I will write a story about the terror and grief implicit in being a parent. I was like, I need cool monsters. We will have a D&D campaign in which we fight a bunch of cool monsters. And then that's what I ended up writing. You know what I mean? So like, and I have generally found that the most productive mode for engaging with like theme is that like I'm not thinking about like theme. I think we said this is like ideally like a 2.5 draft concern.
I mean, it's, you know, I think it depends on where you are in your career and like what you've been doing and so on, right? But certainly I agree with you on the sneaking up on theme, especially early on when you're feeling a little lost. Like if I give you that exercise from the beginning of this episode about writing in a kitchen or a beach, someone's having a conflict, blah, 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 and you're trying to do an info dump of information and you've got to weave that into the dialogue. Generally, when my 15 students all write that same framework, 15 different themes will emerge, right? In the course of that. And then we don't necessarily talk about that in the first week of the semester, but eventually we end up saying like, let's look at these. What themes, and often I will pair them up and be like, okay, here, you've read each other's stories. What themes do you see in this? And then kind of going from there into revision, right? Like, is that actually what you want to write about? Great. Now, having that in mind, go back and redo this piece to highlight this. Like, you know, you touch on this. Do you want to deepen that? Do you want to complicate it? Do you want to like, you know, etc. You know, so
yeah, I mean, I think it can often be that's what I'm saying, like as a second draft thing, like often it can be, I mean, you could do all of the things, right? You could start with theme, and I certainly have had successful moments of writing where people have been like, write about fatherhood, and I'll be like, okay. But like, and also sometimes I don't know what the theme is until long after it's been published. But I think probably the most common mode is that intermediate mode where it's like, I need something fluffy and exciting to distract me, like your students, so they're not paralyzed, so they start writing. And then of course, if you bring your whole self to it, you're going to write theme. And then like, yeah, sure, like I would say the median example is that like second or third draft, it's good to go like, okay, what am I actually writing about here? What can I tease out? But
also,
but so much of it is submerged in the unconscious that it's, you know, I'm sort of resistant to the idea that while I think it can be useful to engage with, I am also reluctant to entirely drag it to the surface. You know what I mean? I feel like it's helpful if some of it is always like submerged in the murky waters of the subconscious. You know what I mean? Like, because I feel like it can easily die or become, you know,
well, there's a way
you can be loss. You can become brittle.
Yeah, you can kind of overwork it, right? Like, so I think you see that sometimes. I have a friend, Lori Rader Day, who's a very fabulous mystery writer, award-winning, and so on. And she was a returning student when I was teaching at Roosevelt University. So she's my age. So she was coming into an MFA program in her late 30s, early 40s, I think. And so she did a couple years of it. She writes beautiful prose, but I think she also kind of came out of it. We would have these conversations mocking the finely crafted sentences, right? That there's a way in which in a graduate program, sometimes you're bringing so much conscious effort to various aspects of this that the end result ends up feeling overworked, clunky, forced, non-organic. You know, you can see the seams, etc. And you know, I think you hear artists who talk about like trying to like what is the strength of quote unquote, I hate this framing, but primitive writers, right? Like primitive artists, right? Like there's a whole thing in art about primitive artists, right? And
like outsider artists.
Outsider artists, right? Like the kind of like, here are the people who have not been corrupted by the school system or whatever, and they have access to a I don't know. I feel like so there's a whole whole problematic narrative here, because then you start getting into like purity narratives and so on. So it's really muddy and murky, and we have to be careful about that too. But there is a sense in which I do think it's valid to talk about, like keeping hold of the joy and integrity of the material. I don't know, and
I think that I think you would avoid the framing of like, oh, these are the pure people. It's not that there's any pure people. It's that if you have a dominant hegemonic system, it is going to stamp out diversity, and you know what I mean. Like you're going to manage to get everyone to think the same. Like, and to some extent, I feel like
I want to be cautious about this, because I hear genre writers complain about graduate school a lot in these terms, and I don't think it's fair. I don't think.
Well, maybe not. I mean,
you'll hear people saying things like, "Oh, they crank out all these people who write bad copies of New Yorker stories," and that is not my experience.
I don't. I'm not making that critique. And when I say a dominant hegemonic system, I don't mean like MFA literary programs, which are, after all, only a tiny slice of the thing. I really meant like education starting in kindergarten, like the entire, like our entire, like essentially, if you find somebody who's sort of out, like if you're reading people, all of whom jump through the same hoops from the time they were 6 to the time they were 25, whatever those hoops are, like, and then you read somebody who hasn't jumped through those hoops, it's going to be a whole other experience, you know?
Yes, but I guess you can, but I guess I'd say like, I just want to highlight that genre also has its own dominant hegemonic systems, right?
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely, sure. No, I don't mean that genre is necessarily no, but I think that and I have a lot of the same issues with like the Turkey City Lexicon and all the received truisms about genre stuff, and like don't show, don't tell, and like it again becomes a series of truisms and conventions that, if left to its own device, I mean, all that stuff is useful. All the stuff they teach you, you know, in the sort of standard Damon Knight tradition of like Turkey City Lexicon, whatever, it's all useful insight. It's a compendium of useful insights. But like applied religiously, you will turn new writers into cookie cutter. You know what I mean? Like if you try to slavishly follow every bit of that as dogma, you'll file off the edges, and everybody sounds the same. Often I have that. I'll read stories in like, you know, one of the science fiction magazines, you know, a couple of stories, and I'm like, this is all, you've all just internalized the same, like there's the wildness is missing.
Right.
And I think that I also think this happens not just at the level of like, you know, people coming out of some program and missing and it having done damage to them, which happens a lot in all kinds of settings, but also even at people at the height of their careers. Like some of my favorite writers at the peak of their powers, I feel like their books are diminished by the fact that I feel like sometimes they've decided and have articulated for themselves what they, capital letters, want to say, and now it's become a programmatic, you know, it's sort of lost kind of some of the wild uncertainty of it, and has become like a you know, they've sort of tipped into, and I love writers who are very politically engaged, so like there is always that danger of them becoming like at certain moments, and it's not that I disagree with their politics, it's people I agree with their politics, but it's like they've tipped over from this being sort of this organic inchoate thing to being you know, to like, it's like the lectury part of them, like the part of them that is delivering a position paper has taken over.
Hello humans, I just wanted to let you guys know about 2 things going on at the Speculative Literature Foundation that might interest you. If you're part of a convention that's happening in 2022 and you know your organization needs a little more financial support, either to expand your programming or to acquire more resources to keep your attendees safe during the pandemic, please consider applying to the SLF's Convention Support Grant. It's open until December 15th. If you'd like to find out more, the link will be in the description. The SLF is also holding our 5th annual art contest, this time with a prize money of $750. We're taking anything sci-fi, fantasy, and speculative in nature, but you'll have lots of freedom in what you choose to portray. The winner of the contest will have their artwork featured on the website, as well as other SLF material. For more details, the link will be in the description. Please share with your artist friends as well. Alright, thanks humans.
Do you read Guy Gavriel Kay? Have you read his stuff?
No, we've talked about this a lot. I haven't read Guy Gavriel Kay.
Really, I've got to get you reading him.
I know you do.
I recently read his most recent. I want to I just finished yesterday, day before, I finished reading the most recent novel of his, and so for people who haven't read, I can try and frame this as I started reading it. He's one of my favorite writers. I had this falling in this moment of oh, yay, what a treat. I get one of his novels again. Here are the same pleasures that I expect from his work, right? Yeah. And that's good. And yet for much of the novel, and this is, he has more than a dozen books in this mode of these historical, slightly fantastical novels set generally in an alternate Europe. And I had a good chunk of, I think maybe he's done, right? Because it was is this just a repetition? And it was getting a little lectury and a little locked in. And I had this disappointment and a little oh, I wanted something wild and whatever. And then I hit a point where he did something I didn't expect, and I burst into tears. So I was okay, well, he's still got it. It's still there's still some of it there. But I do think there is a way in which his work has settled into a framing that maybe is not as vibrant as some. I hate to critique one of my favorite writers, but it's not as vibrant.
Well, I'll do it too. Let me bring an example. Yeah. So I mean, in my personal pantheon, one of the most important of my literary heroes is Le Guin, and of Le Guin's work, among the one that is absolutely most central to me is Earthsea, and I love Earthsea. I love the whole cycle. It's one of the most beautiful and important myths. And, I am not a tenth of the writer that Le Guin is, and my reading is highly fungible. I think it took me at least 2 readings to understand Tahanu. I think I bounced off Tahanu the first time and then came back to it and was this is so much better than
I did too. I think that was a common experience of Tahanu.
Well, I think it's definitely a hard left turn if you're expecting a continuation of, if you're expecting to just go on from the farthest shore in that mode. Tahanu is a whole other thing. But that's also what's amazing about Le Guin. She went from strength to strength and she never stopped questioning and innovating. Yeah. Is that she's constantly writing things and then 10 years later coming back to them and realizing all what she no longer believes in and re-engaging with it.
Yeah. No, that is I agree. I wrote a whole essay about that for Tor.com. You can go look it up, guys.
Excellent. But the thing I was and this is probably a controversial opinion and lots of people disagree with me, but there's something that really where I felt this kind of, she's a very powerful writer. She also has very strong opinions, and there's a moment which felt like sort of the tipping over into polemic problem. Not tipping over into polemic, she's better than that, but when she revised in The Farthest Shore, she goes back and revises a lot of the things that are wrong with Earthsea, right? Which makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of really powerful stuff in the revisionist thing of why are the wizards all men, right? But there's a bit where she gets rid of the land of the dead. Well, spoilers. But in The Farthest Shore, she changes how the afterlife works in Earthsea. And I feel like I could totally see how she had rejected her previous framing because she didn't think she actually believed what she was saying anymore, and it contradicted what she thought should be true about the world, and she didn't want to leave Earthsea with this sort of just received wisdom that she'd occurred that was cool, and she had it all worked out now. But there's a way in which when she did that, I was now, yes, I agree with you. Yes, now we're in the sort of conscious thinky part of my brain where my politics also concurred that this would be better. But the numinous, inchoate power of it is you know what I mean?
I do. I think
again, maybe I should go back and read it again and it would be different. But
I think that's so it's interesting because I feel like what you're talking about there, and maybe this is some of what happened with Kay as well, is not quite, but there is a specific point where the politics, right, and the not that necessarily turns into polemic, but the politics overwhelms the integrity of story, integrity of character, and so on, right? Like I see this in Cory Doctorow's work, like For the Win. I loved For the Win up until the end of it.
I loved For the Win too.
And then at the end, the end of it, I mean, spoiler, but like, the scrappy anti-corporate people win, and
sometimes they are like handed away. Sometimes there's a bit of handing the right side the win, whether or not that actually.
I didn't buy it. It didn't.
Like we skipped to the good part because we'd already decided there was going to be this ending.
Right.
Yeah.
I
feel like that. I mean,
I'd love to get to that ending, but I felt you needed 2 more books and like a big failure.
I feel like Cory,
before
the
that.
amazing writer, and Cory, the amazing political thinker, are often at war. And that like sometimes the political thinker wins out. But I think that, I think the thing with, I think it's broader than politics, and I think that like even the example of Le Guin, even the greatest writers, like the minute. The reason I originally brought this up is that second draft, we're like, well, what are your themes? Well, that can be a really powerful question, but there is always, even for the greatest writers, I feel like there is a moment of danger as soon as you think you've got it figured out.
Yeah.
As soon as you've figured out what the story is about,
you can
there is a bit of a red flag.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Where
true.
It's like, now you could reduce the story to what you've figured out. Whereas in a sense, it's always greater than whatever. Like there's always more going on. And there's a danger of tidying it up into what you have decided is true about it.
So I agree with all of that, and I think that's and this is, I feel like we were maybe talking about this in another episode, the kind of like the sense of like the artists who talk about the muse and so on. Like we are often reaching for something that is larger than what we can consciously bring to the table, right? And so
I mean, I think it's our conscious minds tend to be conceited and think they run the show, and they really are a very small part of our brains.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. There's
our conscious minds are extremely impressed with themselves in terms of what's actually going on neurologically. It's a lot bigger than that. You know what I mean?
Well, then, so I agree with all that. So in our last 20 or so minutes, I want to come back to, so when we say oeuvre crit, I realize we didn't I don't know if everyone knows.
We didn't really talk about it.
I don't know if everyone knows that word even. So oeuvre, OUEVRE, is like your whole work, right? Your oeuvre. And it's perhaps kind of arrogant of us 10 years or 15 years in to be like, oh yes, I have an oeuvre, but we're arrogant. It is what we are. Yes, it is whatever it is at the time. And so we wanted to look at kind of like our whole work at this point and think about a little bit about direction next. And so it's interesting, like I found it super satisfying and I think thought-provoking and useful in the moment. I remember that. I actually don't remember any specifics of what you told me. Yeah. I remember what I told you, right?
Yeah, what did you tell me?
Well,
I think you told me to write about parenting, among other things.
That was one of
the. And I did a lot since then. Like, that was one of the. Clearly, looking at my work since then, I have followed your advice.
Yeah, it was one of the major things where you and parenting and religion, right? Yeah. I felt like you and I had a lot of conversations about parenting and a religion, and at that point, I wasn't seeing that in your work, and I wanted to know why that wasn't in your work.
Yeah.
So that was.
Interesting.
Right.
It would be interesting to know when that was, because I feel like, it is interesting that that is interesting to see what I've become. And I feel like if you go back, there is in a sense lots of parenting and religion, but they're both oblique. Like in a way, of course, the Siege of Cranes, which I'd written before that, like it's all about parenting, except it's about not parenting because your kid's been stolen, or I don't know. There's a lot more. Now I'm writing much more directly.
We'd be having those like meaty conversations about like the concrete details of raising kids, right? That wasn't making its way into your work.
Where is this in your work?
And so and it it's sort of not surprising because if you're trying to write, to some extent like classic science fiction, there wasn't a space for that in the work, right? Like there's very little room for that, or even adventure fantasy. Like that is one of the things, of course, is a lack of models. Like you have to
It is interesting. I mean, that's The Unraveling is a book largely about parenting and its complement childing, which is like, I think, just as big a deal.
Right. Yeah.
Like we talk a lot about how to parent, but like we're also extremely engaged in how to be a child from the day we're born. And another thing I have a lot of feelings about, and so childing and parenting being big themes of that book, like it still does feel like it's a bit of an odd. It will be interesting to see how many people want to read a book about parenting and which is largely concerned with parenting and childing 500,000 years from now.
It's a great book. So I actually haven't read the most recent draft yet. So I'm looking forward to doing that. I think I'm supposed to read it and possibly give you a blurb. But the previous draft that I read was great, and now I'm like, I hope he didn't kill it in the process of reworking it. Yeah. So we'll find out.
We will.
Yeah. So
that book has changed dramatically many different times. But
different times. So I don't know if you remember anything about when you read my stuff, what you thought of it at the time, now I'm sort of like, have I fulfilled the promise of those years?
I'm not sure if it was then. We certainly had a lot of conversations in the ensuing years about the conflict in Sri Lanka and the whole, you're wrestling with I don't know, the legacy of your family history and stuff, which of course is a big part. Is a big part already to some extent of Bodies in Motion. But
no, I think
I remember. I don't know. I remember something touching on that.
It was interesting because I was in a transitional time. I think right then, right? I had if it was in 2006, 2007, I had finished Bodies in Motion, and it had just come out, and it had also crashed. The follow-up novel had crashed and burned, right?
Yeah.
Like I had, we're gonna do a separate episode just on this about how I had a big novel contracted with HarperCollins for a lot of money that ended up getting canceled because they hated what I wrote. So essentially,
we're gonna do an episode on failures in general on our Dark Nights of the Soul.
Dark Nights of the Soul. But I think it may be that we did the Overcrit after that, where I was really looking for
casting about.
Yeah, like what should I be working on? And what actually I ended up doing, I think, in the next couple of years, I also had a baby, right? So I had my daughter was born in 2007. So right after that, I think I may have even been pregnant when we did this. I can't remember, or about to be. And I wrote a fantasy novel with, that summer of 2007, like with her wearing her in a carrier on my chest and typing around her, right? So I have this YA fantasy novel, which didn't find a home. I may come back to it because I think it has a lot of good stuff in it, but it's sort of too Marion Zimmer. No, it's too Wrinkle in Time-ish in writing style for the current mode. I went to write YA fantasy and I wrote the way people wrote decades ago. And so there's a whole interesting conversation there about how the field has changed. And it's like my stuff is that draft is much less immediate than much less emotional, like emotions to the forefront. Than what the kids are reading today, which I think is really, and I got that comment from like multiple editors, and I had to I'm like, okay, well, they know the pulse of the field, which is fascinating, right? And to be fair, my daughter, I tried to get her to read A Wrinkle in Time, and she was bored, right?
No, it is interesting. Like that, definitely YA has emerged as this literary mode, which isn't just about the age of the protagonist, but partly has to do with the directness and immediacy and the kind of structural things. It's interesting.
So I wrote that book, and that didn't go anywhere. And then at that point, I was feeling like super burnt out with traditional publishing, and I had seen Tim Pratt and Tobias Bickel run Kickstarters. They were some of the first people in the genre to run Kickstarters they had series which had been canceled, and they knew they had fans, and they wanted to finish the series. So they ran Kickstarter to finish the series, which was great and worked. And I was like, maybe I should do a Kickstarter to fund something that I just want to write. And this, I think this ties in actually pretty nicely to the stuff you were talking about, because I was absolutely looking for the fun. I had spent like 15 years working really hard on very serious stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
trying to write great literary fiction, and I'd been burned by the publishing industry, and I was exhausted and full of imposter syndrome and self-doubt. I'd had highs that went to lows, and so I was like, I'm gonna write sci-fi erotica, and it's gonna be a blast, right? And so that was what I pitched for the Kickstarter.
Right.
And I said, I need $8,000 to do this, and people, so I can pay for some childcare, because now I've got 2 kids, and I can't do any writing because I've got a toddler and an infant, and it funded, and then it ended up getting picked up by a small press. But in the process of writing The Stars Change, it changed title from the original Kickstarter title, but The Stars Change. In the process of writing that, all of the themes came back. It was
just what I was saying, right?
It's exactly what happened, right? Like I started off like, I'm going to do fun sci-fi erotica, and it is that. I don't know if it's fun. I think the fun may have disappeared. It's sci-fi erotica, but it is also the Sri Lankan War translated into science fiction, right? Like that. All of the obsessions that were in Bodies in Motion in the literary fiction came forward and emerged finally in like this thing I'd been trying to do for a decade, marrying the litfic realist values of sort of like deep characterization and themes, with getting to do cool things with aliens and using and not having it be superficial. I think that's like, I want to highlight that. I think doing it as science fiction let me address things better than I would have been able to in mainstream lit. And I think that's a part of the conversation that gets neglected, right? That there's we talk about in my sci-fi lit class, we talk about cognitive estrangement and the way in which when you translate something to a science fictional framework, it lets you look at it from a different angle, a different lens. So I can write about, like in my story Plea, I can write about the Syrian refugee crisis, but because I'm writing about space whales, people reading the story don't bring all their preconceptions about the Syrian refugee crisis to the story, right? And it lets me push a couple other angles and highlight things in.
And I mean, I also think that framing, I mean, I completely agree with you. I also think that framing makes it sound, it's a little reductive, because of course it isn't just about the Syrian refugee crisis, right? I mean, you're drawing from, or you're reframing something, but it's not allegory, it's symbol. Like it always becomes more than its source. Like, sure, it casts a shadow in the real world of like, yes, it's drawn from these things, but also it's sort of, I think at its best, like when science fiction and fantasy, well, again, there are 9 and 60 ways of constructing tribal A's. This is one way, right? Like, but where it is towing the line between, of course, it points beyond and represents and reimagines something. It has an analog, it has a correspondent, but also it grows beyond that because because it's more than allegory. It has its own internal logic, and that own internal logic of like, they are actually the space whales, though, right? So they have to act like they may be also the Syrian refugees, but then they're also space whales, and so both of those things at once, and that leads you to say fresher and more. Again, it leads you beyond your conscious mind, and you're like, if you're sort of sitting down to be like, what should I express to people about the Syrian refugee crisis? That's like in your conscious mind. There's like some set of like things which we agree with, and okay, but like making it space whales causes you then to say things you didn't know that you had to say about it. And you're no longer just talking about that. To some extent, I feel like the more you're authentically also talking about space whales, and they're not a little Potemkin screen, that is almost what endows it its depths and allows you to transcend your own, whatever, your own, there's your own opinions, which can be useful and important, and are your thinking, but like also you want as an artist to kind of go beyond your own opinions. You know what I mean? Like your own opinions is like your monkey mind. It's like your little ego thinking some things. And like there's a way you can touch a much broader space, partly by honoring the internal logic of the story. I feel like it's like, how in C.S. Lewis, there's like, I feel like it's very clear reading Narnia that there are these two C.S. Lewises at war. There's this Anglican, guy, like theologian with all these very strong, clear, dogmatic opinions about like salvation and morality, and like, you know, he's definitely like towing Anglican dogma.
Yeah.
And then there's this other C.S. Lewis that loves like pagan fantasy and that is constantly kind of at war, and he's constantly kind of being led to sort of imply things he probably would disapprove of with his, you know, at 9 in the morning, on Sunday morning in church. Like he would frown at these opinions, but they have crept up with the satyrs and the unicorns under the cover of night into his prose, and it's richer than he means it to be.
And I think in his science fiction, right, in Paralandra and That Hideous Strength, like both of those, Out of the Silent Planet, I think was pretty straightforward, but the further he got into that series, the more things kind of started pushing at those boundaries.
I mean,
right?
those are really fascinating science fiction, and also they're like really radical in terms of what was going on in terms of science fiction, and also pretty damn radical in terms of Christian theology. Just to like, and it's all, that's the beauty of it. That's sort of what I'm saying. Like, to get the story to work, to honor the storyness of it, to make the reader, to do this thought experiment where the reader is plausibly imagining this as a vivid dream, he has to go kind of far afield from what he would necessarily approve of as a you know, as you know, like, I mean, wow, like the reason that there's the devil is that it's a localized phenomenon to this planet. All those other planets are out there just fine in a pre-fall condition under God's law, but the devil is the archon of this world who has seized it and taken control, and Christ ends up being like this paratrooper, you know, mission to like, which is like a hell of a theodicy, and like, you know, not something that I expect the church hierarchy would approve of, you know, but like he ends up there, I think, just by the logic of story, and we you know, and I think that's a kind of a cool example. Like, to the extent that we follow the logic of the story, we often get to be like bigger than we are, you know, bigger than our conscious minds would otherwise allow. And you know, I don't know.
I think this was great. As we're heading towards wrapping up, I'm realizing, like, did we actually say anything here that's useful to newer writers? And I'm not sure. I think
follow your passion.
Follow your passion. But they often don't know what
necessarily,
it is.
Well, but that's the thing is, I think it's really about the space. You know, Linda Berry has this wonderful comic. You know, Linda Berry, the comic artist, and I forget what it's called. It's one place it appeared is in the McSweeney's sort of comic book. I think the first of their sort of comics special issues. But it's about how when you're a kid, you know, there's this jouissance of like making up wild fantasy, and then you start having and then the first time somebody praises it, you get this question like this demon lurking on your shoulder of like, is it good? And then somebody, like, she's writing, and then somebody disapproves of it, and then she got another demon that's like, does it suck? And the like, is it good? Does it suck? Is like completely sucks up all the creative space, and like she has to get past them. I feel like that doing whatever you can to create the sense of like play and fun.
I have an idea. So what you're saying now gives me the idea for an exercise you could do. So think about this. Like, you're teaching a creative writing class, and you ask people to just make a list of 10 things you love in right? That's it. Just love in fiction, but also not in fiction, perhaps, right? Like, and in part, and then like just have that as a seed, like maybe on the first day of class. That would be kind of amazing. And it's in part, this is funny because, so right now I'm working on 2 novels. One is a almost finished draft of a jump space novel. The other one is the start of what I think is going to be maybe a multi-book epic in that same universe, right? And it has, part of what I need to do is some invention. I have to create a couple different alien species, which I find difficult, and maybe we could do a whole episode on that at some point, because I have trouble with it, because I feel like I'm just doing sometimes like, here are the cat people, here are the, you know, the otter.
Let's have a podcast brainstorming about your alien species.
That would actually be super useful to me. But but the, like, how do you do a better job with this? But, and can we get David Moles on it too? Because I think that would be really helpful.
Let's do that.
So, but I had this moment recently where I was reading, you know, Martha Wells has this Murderbot series, right? She released them as novellas. They were great, very popular. And then she just released the first novel in the series, but really it's it's in sequence, so you should read all the novellas first and then the novel. So I read that, and then it was we're in the midst of pandemic. I was super sad that I'd finished it and there were no more Murderbot books. So I was like, well, what else has she written? And I went to go look for her other work, and which I've now read all of. But her previous series is this Raksura series, and the Raksura series is fantasy and has these dragons who also have a humanoid form. And as I was reading, and it's also like, it was really helpful to me because she sets them in a world that is incredibly vibrant with diverse species. Like around every corner is a new species, and it was that was helpful to me in terms of aiming for profligacy in life, right? Which anyway, but I realized that part of why I was getting so much joy out of the books, I really they made me incredibly happy, was because of the dragons, right? And it was just like, just like I think we maybe said in a previous episode, maybe this was when I was talking to Cal, that Shauna McCarthy for Realms of Fantasy used to said on a panel once that she tried to buy stories with dragons whenever she could, because every time she put a dragon on the cover, newsstand sales jumped 50%. So, and I think I had been resistant to
dragons.
To dragons as a result, right? Like
resistant
a little
to
bit,
dragons, yes,
right?
sure.
And then I kind of had this moment of like, well, I've already got
the dragons, Marianne.
I've already got these lizardy creatures in my world.
Sure.
I'm like, I almost
fuck it, I want dragons.
I want dragons, right? Like, so they're going to be dragons. And wait, it gets better, because I was thinking about the mass problem, right? Of if I want shape,
I remember your Facebook post.
So if I want shape-changing dragons that can go to humanoid form, either you've got to keep them about the same size, or which is just less satisfying than having big old dragons, right? Or you've got to find some way of accounting for, if it's science fiction, some way of accounting for the change in mass.
Sure.
And I'm planning to hand wave a sort of dimensional shifty kind of thing, which is also what she does. She and that's also how she lets them like get away with having clothes when they shape change, is because they kind of learn to carry the clothes with them through the shift, right? So they're kind of like stored in this dimensional pocket while they're dragons, right?
Sure.
It's kind of hilarious. And then I had this moment of like, but if I'm doing that, you've got dragons shifting through dimensions. Don't you now have like Anne McCaffrey's Pern dragons who can teleport through dimensions through between?
Right.
I'm like, I can do both. I can have shape-changing teleporting dragons, and that will be awesome. And so I have to think of it. This was like my big moment last week of like, I just went around delighted all day, and I still am when I think about it. And now, will that survive the story drafting process? We'll see. That's going to set up some challenges.
Who knows?
But also some opportunities. So,
And I feel like this also leads to the you wanted us to sum up and say like, what are we teaching the children? One thing I want to say is that like, while what are your themes can be perhaps a useful question in some context, it is also daunting, and perhaps potentially a more useful question is, what is your jam?
Yeah. What is your jam? Well,
not that there's just one, but like now, what is your jam?
I think that might be the title for this episode if we need a title.
Like dragons are your jam. I don't know. It's like shifting, teleporting dragons. Like in this moment, that's my jam. Like, and that's like maybe just like it's allowed to be fun. And another thing that's related to that is things that you can do to lower the stakes are sometimes really helpful. Like sometimes a lot of the things I've written that have been best are because I, for whatever reason, wasn't taking it too seriously. Yeah. Like you have to take it the right amount seriously. I mean, neither you nor I have a tendency to like phone in shoddy craftsmanship, right? It's not like, I can imagine that some people might have to like work hard, but like I'm likely to obsess over things for like, and like never ship them because like I spent 100 years polishing them. So like for me, it's really useful.
And I'll just pause and say my manifestation is I avoid working on it because I'm scared of messing it up. So,
and that So you've polished it forever, avoid working on it. Like I do that too. A really useful thing is to, in one way or another, lower the stakes. Like have something in your head where like, well, it's only, And
there are days. There are days when I miss the drunken writer, right? Like I feel like I don't.
Well, that's a potentially dangerous way to lower the stakes. Yes,
well,
you can use chemical substances.
Like I don't do it, and kids, I don't advocate it, right? But there are moments where I'm like, if if only I could do that safely.
That
would
be historically
like that's what it was for, right? Like that was the idea.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like maybe like some people can do that for, you know, if you're William Burroughs, you could shoot up heroin for your entire career and still be writing at 80. For many people, I feel like that's a short-term strategy. Anyway, but I think one thing is like just having, like, a lot of times if I'm just writing something, I don't know, for some contest or like for some on a dare from a friend, like a lot of in-jokes, like, you know, the story. So one of my Hugo nominated stories, Biographical Notes of the Discourse on a Discourse to the Nature of Causality with Airplanes by Benjamin Rosenbaum, was a lark because it was like just before David Moles and Jay Lake's All-Star Zeppelin stories, small press anthology, which was like a goofy little anthology about Zeppelins, totally in the realm of like fun.
Wait, was that Moles and Lake? I thought Susan Groppe was involved.
Susan Groppe's 20 Epics. The second one from All-Star Press is 20 Epics, where A Siege of Cranes appeared.
Got it.
Which we referenced earlier in the podcast. But yes, that was Moles and Lake. Zichron Levracha. Anyway, may his memory be for a blessing. So anyway, but I was at a party. I've told the story lots of times. Maybe even we've already discussed this. But I was at a party and I was like, so we were talking about his anthology, and I was like, what genres have you not yet gotten submitted? And we've sort of like, we're brainstorming like, well, there's no Victorian romance, there's no sky pirates. I was expecting some sky pirates. There's no metafiction. There's no, I don't know, like there was a whole like mysteries. There's no mysteries. So I was just like, I will write a story that is all of those things and contain like a whole bunch of, and like literally call out WisCon and like have a whole bunch of, I don't know, just like and like Paul Melko is Tuckerized, and I don't know. It was just like completely in jokes and a lark, and that very like silliness really, like, I think it's, you know, like I ended up writing a much better story than I would have had I, you know, laboriously been trying to do something great. So lowering the stakes is good. Finding your jam is good. I feel like, you know, one thing I think is interesting is I don't know if this would work for everybody, but like if I were teaching an MFA course and wanted to like be extremely provocative and maybe get in trouble with the head of my department, one of the exercises I might consider is having them write fanfic. Like, and even if they don't write fanfic or no fanfic, it could be fanfic of anything, like whatever you like, because like,
I mean, I would argue that Mallory and Tennyson are fanfic, right? When
sure. Definitely. So, right. Of course. I mean, it's fanfic. The Aeneid is fanfic of the Odyssey. Like it's fanfic all the way down, but like really, like, yes, of course. And it's sort of like but what I mean by that is shamelessly go ahead and ride on the coattails of something you already love. Whatever your jam is, whatever you're into, just jump in there.
I am still waiting for Paramount to call me for my Star Trek novel. I've got it plotted out. You know, like one of these days I'm going to get famous enough. They're going to be like, Marianne, do you want to write a Star Trek novel? I'd be like, yes. It's going to be classic Trek, Jim Kirk. Well, let me tell you about it.
Okay. Yes, I mean, it seems like if it were Picard, you'd get more traction with certain series.
I love Kirk. I love Kirk. You got to go where your jam is.
No, you do. You have to go where your jam is. That's precisely what we were saying. You're a lot like Kirk too. Anyway, so
well, you know, he's deeply flawed. I mean, this is okay. To go into a tiny bit of Star Trek geekery, I love that they did the Picard series. I enjoyed it. I love that they got Michael Chabon to write it. On the other hand, there's a level on which it was fundamentally a little unconvincing to me because it relies on like, well, here's Picard's big flaw, this is his big mess up, etc. And part of the framing of Picard from the beginning is that he's just not that guy. He's not the guy who has the big flaw and the big mess up, right? He's the guy who, you know, no matter what, follows the prime directive, right? He's like, you know, and so it's like, it was kind of a difficult problem to set. They kind of like almost pulled it off, and you know, great to have that actor doing this. But Kirk is. But
in a way, it's a different character,
right? Kirk is. It's easy to show the screw ups with Kirk because he screws up so many times.
Do you read Aubrey and Maturin? Have you read the?
I read the.
You know, Patrick O'Brien.
Yes, I did a long time ago.
Anyway, because that always made me. I always felt like that was sort of like Kirk and Spock, if they could have really followed it to its logical conclusion. Like if they, if they could have, well, I mean, Matt Hearn is both Spock and Bones rolled into one, and Aubrey is like, like literally they have to get the ship the hell out of port because he's been caught sleeping with the governor's wife.
It's a great series, and Naomi Novik takes that, puts it in, adds magic and dragons, and makes it awesome.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, what could go, what could be better?
Sure. So speaking of fan fiction, and it's just like the perfect confluence. Okay, we're wrapping up. I think we've covered like much of this really well, and I've said everything I want to say. The last thing, I knew there was one thing I had forgotten. A lot of the time we've been talking about stories, right? And
I do want to say one other thing about you go first, but all right.
So I guess my last thing I wanted to say is like sneaking up on stories. I think works pretty well, and tapping your unconscious, always good when possible. And maybe we can at some point talk about strategies for that don't involve alcohol. But like things like I find that like if I set a story idea in my head and then go take a long shower, sometimes that will unlock it. Or commuting, oddly, like I've got a 45-minute drive.
Showers and bicycles are usually the things I call out.
Let me think about this story, set it in my head, and then ponder it for 45 minutes while I'm driving. So but I would say that for Bodies in Motion, right? So I've had one big book that I think that I worked on for 4 years that was pretty successful in achieving what it hoped to achieve, and got great reviews, blah blah blah. And I would say there was a tipping point with that book where and they're linked short stories, where the first half of the book, writing 40,000 words or so, there was a lot of unconscious work happening, right? I would write a story, I'd write another story, here's a connection between them. There was a lot of randomness.
Serendipitous.
And then, but I do think once I started going into the second half, which I wrote much faster, like the first half took 3 years, the second half took 1 year to like draft and revise the whole thing. I had an intention at that point, and like I knew what my themes were, and I was looking to fill holes, right? Because I was exploring these issues of family and silence and the damage that gets done when people keep secrets. And so I would think like, okay, I have this story with an arranged marriage. I want to be sure that I also have a story with a love marriage that looks at this from another angle. And do you know what I mean? So like there's
sure.
So I just
that is the point at which I think theme can be useful,
right?
Where it's an idea generator.
I think especially for longer works, there's a conscious. You do bring. It can be advantageous to bring that conscious crafting into it.
Yeah, but there's a bunch of different levels there because there's one. I mean, there's more than one thing going on there because I often find a point in terms of plot where like I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just making crap up, and then like at a certain length, which if you're writing 1,000 words, or 500 words, like you never need to know what you're doing. You just find that you reach the end and it worked. Like you never emerged from the dream. You know what I mean?
Right.
But by the time something gets to like 6,000 words, I reach some point where I have to be like, how is this gonna end? And then like at a longer length, and I started short and had to sort of educate myself at these different to figure this out.
Me too.
And there's a funny bit, whether that story that I mentioned earlier, biographical notes. One of the funny things is that like it's a metafictional story in which I'm like, it's another Benjamin Rosenbaum who's the narrator, who's and one of the funny metafictional things about it is I actually dramatized the process because I wrote that story and had all these absurd swashbuckling coincidences. And then having written them, I was like, so now I have to sit down and figure out how these all make sense. And the character is doing the same thing. Like, so the character is like, let me figure out how it could possibly be that all these things, which is literally what I was doing. Like, so like there's a moment in the story where it's like, maybe we can make all these, which I had no idea what the answer to the riddle was any more than the character did until the character figured it out and then I did. So, but you know what I mean? Like I do feel like there's a point at which, but that could be about plot. It could be about theme. It could be about motivation. Like the moment of like having to go figure out what happened, like how this is all going to work out. Depends. Were you done? There's a couple other things I want to say on the general.
You say your thing.
question.
I think I'm done. So
the other couple things I want to say on the general sort of question, like, because there is a sort of a technique or like a strategy level of like, so how do you decide what to write? Which I sort of feel like I've made a bunch of grand pronouncements, and some of them have been good, but there's some like specific. I don't want to neglect to mention some like specific tricks of the trade, since that's sort of where we're going. So one thing is that in terms of techniques, besides taking a shower and riding your bicycle and driving for non-alcohol lubricated, freeing your unconscious, there is like a very classic thing, which I like, that Natalie Goldberg Writing Down the Bones, series of books on this, which is like literally just writing. Like, oddly, writing is often the antidote to not knowing what to write, because often when you're like facing the blank page trying to think of what the correct thing to write is, you are nowhere near the part of your brain that should be. So if you just write all the like, I don't know what to write, but
just for people who haven't read this book, I recommend Writing Down the Bones all the time. It's a great workshop book, and she has she recommends timed writings, right? So you like, I think that's an important piece of this. You because again, it lowers the stakes. I only have to do this for 10 minutes, right? Like, I'm going to do this for 10 minutes.
Keep your hand moving. Doesn't matter what you write. Don't cross anything out. Don't correct any spelling errors. It's surprisingly
functional. Like, it really helps.
Yeah.
So.
And that, and even longhand, like sometimes on a computer, sometimes longhand. But I do a variant of that. Like, that's a very specific set exercise. But I mean, even if I'm just like, I don't know what to do, like, I have like copious notes and I just like randomly yell at myself, like I write little letters to myself about the plot and stuff, and like very often it's the physical act of writing. I don't know what I want to say before my fingers are moving. So that is a lot of like tapping into the unconscious. It's a feedback loop of your eyes seeing what's the marks on the paper and interpreting them, and then that going into your thinking, which produces more marks on the paper. Like, the external part of that loop is really important. Like, it's very different than just doing it in your head. Another thing I want to say is very often world building. So one access that I have, one specific kind of thing, is that like world building will come first. Like, that I will have an idea and I don't know what it's for. Like, I will have some kind of like just sort of purely intellectual idea. Like I was working with XSLT, which is a tool where you take one kind of document that's like a big, like an XML document, and then you have this totally different little kind of document, and it produces this whole other XML document. So it's not like two similar things are coming together to produce a thing. It's like one thing which is really big, and one thing which is kind of little, but then it produces another really big thing. And I was like, what if sexual reproduction worked like this? Right? Like, what if instead of having like we are like haploid, we have two very similar things coming. What if it was like really like there was a it's like very complicated long thing, and then there's something little that was like filtering it and recreating it, but they were like totally disparate from one another. And that ends up being sort of the sexual reproduction system inside the like virtualized emulated computer world in True Names, which is my collaboration with Cory Doctorow, where there are these strategies which are large, and then these filters which are this sort of, and then it's Jane Austen. So the strategies are kind of like, then they have like these are like Austinian genders essentially. But I didn't know what story to set in that world for a long time. Like, I had this, or like basically I'll have like world building ideas kicking around, and I will like flesh them out long before I actually know what story I want to tell there. And then they're like a home for a story. You know what I mean? And like another thing is, and then like, so Embracing the New, which I wrote at Clarion, I had this whole world building idea about like, memory leeches that were like symbiotes that like carried your memory. And then like Octavia Butler told us, just free write for like 20 minutes on like a unpleasant, like a painful personal memory. And then like turn the page and just start writing, and don't refer to the person. Don't put the personal memory in the story. Just like with that energy, like write the last word of that. Go and start a story.
Did you say this was Octavia Butler?
Yeah, Octavia Butler.
You had her for one of your teachers.
Yes, I'm like, didn't you know that?
My God. I am overwhelmed with jealousy. I'm just going to sit here and simmer in that for a while. Go on.
I mean, to be fair, it was like the year after you had Delaney, but yeah, or maybe a couple years after you had Delaney. Anyway, I did, and that was a pivotal yes, of course, that was like the summit of my.
Okay.
Yes,
okay. All right.
My hero.
Sorry. little goddess moment there. So yes,
it was amazing. Anyway, so she there's more stories about that which I can tell. But anyway, but her thing was just write about something sad that happened to you and then go jump into a story. And I think A, that's a great exercise, which you should do, and B, whoever's listening, if you want, and B, like the fact that I was carrying around a bunch of world building without knowing what story meant that like when I jumped into it, I was like in this world that I already knew how the world worked.
Well, so that's I think. So I have a lot of trouble starting speculative fiction for this reason, right? Because there's so much that you need to invent to give like even a basic frame. One of the reasons why I'm really glad that I'm finally kind of like settled into this jump space universe, even though I'm still discovering things and deciding things, is that a lot of it is fixed now, right? And so I know that we have psionics. I know that we have this or that or whatever, and it means that, to give an example, a couple nights ago, my husband and I were having a fight, a sort of pandemic times fight about being trapped together in this small space, leading to us being very crotchety with each other. And we're fine now. But I kind of came out of it with this moment of, you know, I'm working on these war stories in my jump space universe, and I want to write one story about a couple that breaks apart because of being trapped together in some war-related situation, and like the end of the story is going to be essentially like one of them turning to the other and saying like, if this had never happened, do you think we would have made it? And and the other person saying yes, of course, right? And and so I don't know where that's going to go in my universe in terms of plot, in terms of will they be human or alien or whatever else. Like all of that is still to be determined, but I can now take that theme and deposit it in my universe, and it'll bloom into a story. Like I know that's going to be a story, and I know it's going to be a good story, right? Like, and so it's a funny moment when you get to the world being that constructed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I mean, that can certainly happen if you have this big, you know, I mean, I think some people really do. Like, I was sort of the opposite, that like, it's only recently I've ever like even written a sequel. Like for a while, I created an entire universe for every story, partly because that's what my way into the story was, like figuring out some like concept that I thought was intriguing or cool, or like a what if. But I mean, either way, I do think that is like that kind of idle dreaming where you're sort of imagining like the way things work without necessarily having like you don't necessarily need to be. I think sometimes it's overly constraining to be like, now I must write a story, so like beginning, middle, end, plot, and character, whatever. But like sometimes you could just be making shit up, and like later it'll find its way into that form, like or not. But like, you know what I mean? Like you're laying a groundwork. Like trust yourself that you're laying the groundwork, whether you're like, and I mean, the world building is one piece of it. The like fight you had, and you're like, okay, well now I know there's a fight and that they break up, and that, right? It's like floating around. It hasn't connected with everything else yet. But I think partly one thing to learn is just like the patience to allow all those little bits to accumulate, and then like gradually they, you know, you begin to fit them together like a jigsaw puzzle. So another couple of techniquey things. One thing is when I have a world, like let's say I've come up with this sort of, well, here's a way that things could work. Sometimes it's extrapolative, like what, you know, if this goes on, or like what if this, you know, what if the world could work like the way this one little corner of it works. And then one tried and true, this isn't original with me, but one standard thing that I find quite useful, however, is the question who suffers, right? Particularly, like one thing I like to do is like think of the best world I could, like how, like realistically, how could this be? How could a utopia actually work? And then be like, okay, but for whom does this suck? It's never going to be a utopia for everyone, right? And so there's a way in which it's also, in a way, it's a sort of political praxis of like, on the one hand, being like, it's easy to imagine everything going to hell. That's happening in front of our eyes. What would be like what if I were to dare myself to imagine things being better? And then at the same time, like, let me not drink my own Kool-Aid too much. Now that I've figured it out, for whom does this suck? You know what I mean? Right. And that is actually a very interesting engine. But I think in general, like it doesn't have to be suffers, but like who who's the person, like you've set up this world, who's the person to whom the interesting thing is happening? Who's the person for whom a lot is at stake? Who's the person whose world is changing? You know what I mean? Like that's that looking for that, hunting for that character is a technique. I had another thing that I do, which is like a whole different part of my brain in a way, much more the like literary part of my brain and much less the science fiction part of my brain, although they can intersect, is like to begin purely with almost with sound. But in particular, I did a thing for a while where I would like think of them really absurd, like the silliest sentence that I could think of, or like the most absurd, like weird juxtaposition of things in a sentence, and then like challenge myself to make that make sense. Like by the end of the story, we will, you know what I mean? Like like on Orange World, the world, Sheila exploded and the air was full of gumballs. Like by the end of it, now I have no idea what this is about. I have no idea what I'm talking about, but like I've put this stake in the ground. Like I have declared this thing to be the case. It wouldn't have to be a sentence. It could be, some scene. It could be some image, and be like, how then to set the puzzling part of your brain to work, and like, how could that, like, what does that, what is it that I am looking at? Like, how could that work? And sort of rigorously challenge yourself to make it work, on some level, is another thing that I do. Oh, and I have one more, which is that, and you touched on this a couple of times with the example of the Murderbot dragons is an example, but I think that it's again, when I was like miseducated into this modernist myth that I would sit in my garret and the muse would distend and I would have personal truths that were revealed only to me and were part of my essential nature that I would give out to the world as my great art, like that what I was missing is the extent to which it's a conversation, and to the extent a lot of what we're doing is reacting and being like, that's awesome, or no, you're doing that wrong. And I think in some ways the sweet spot, like a lot of the best work for me to react to in fiction is when it's both, is when I encounter something or some set of things where I'm like excited by it and yet also pissed off.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because that's when I want to grab the wheel. Like to an extent, it could be something I'm just excited and I want to play in that garden, like you were saying about oh, dragons, I could do shape-shifting dragons. Or it could just be something where I'm like, no, you people don't understand. Like that's not how time travel works or whatever. And then I want to do it right. But like there's a way in which all the like the best, the sweetest spot is when it's like both like, oh my God, I so love what you're doing. And also, no, not that. Go the other way. Like I'm excited about this work, and then it takes a turn away from the way I want it to go. That's like a galvanizing impulse to like go make it do what I want.
Yeah, I want to bring out a couple things that my graduate advisor, Catherine Cole, said when I was doing my PhD at the University of Utah, because I walked in with my Bodies in Motion in an early draft, and she it's kind of funny, like there are several things she said that are relevant to this. At one point she was reading some of the early stories and said, Marianne, you have to start inventing things, because I was writing really kind of like autobiography, and she's like, you have to give yourself permission to change things and invent characters and invent incidents that will highlight what you're trying to talk about, etc. Right? So that was a moment that transformed my fiction writing. There was another moment where I came in and I was kind of like flopped down in her chair in her office hours, and I was like, I just keep writing about mothers and daughters arguing about sex and the silences, and I feel like I'm in such a rut. And she's like, no, you're not in a rut, those are your tropes. I was like, oh, I have tropes, right? That's like super exciting to me. Like so that was helpful as a framework. And then there was a third thing. What was the other thing that she said? Well, so this is sort of maybe a little tangential, but I think it connects. There was a point where I'd been writing this story, and I had been kind of like caught up in my cleverness, and I had it going sort of, I started in the present day, and then the stories went backwards in time to this hinge point, and then halfway through the book they came forward in time, and it made it kind of like a puzzle and a mystery. You're kind of figuring things out and so on. And she said, you're making the reader work very hard, and that's fine, but every time you make the reader work hard, there has to be a payoff that is worth that work, and you think you have that payoff here. And I kind of like stopped, and I had to go away and look at it, and I ended up saying like, no, like this is really just to like play with my own cleverness. And once I put that aside, I was like, this actually works better chronologically. Let me just start in 1940 and come forward, right? So
but I think that story which you just told could easily be misinterpreted, because I just want to highlight that it's like the takeaway there is not don't entertain yourself by doing clever things. The takeaway is that's your first draft. Because actually, like, it can be a real end, like that's a great scaffolding to have this like clever intellectual game you're playing is a great first draft thing to be doing. And then it's a great third draft thing to be doing, to go, well, you know, I don't need it to be that complicated. I'm just gonna do the more obvious thing, like to trust yourself not to need it to be like a clever intellectual game, unless it's the payoff of the reader. I mean, just what you said, the payoff of the reader. But I would hate to have people try to abandon that from the beginning, because maybe it was a really good idea to have that.
No. Like it was fun, right? It made it fun for me to write it initially, but also it was, you know, when I first started writing, my ideas about it were very thin. By the time I got all the way through, there was a lot of depth to it, and it didn't need the scaffold anymore, right?
Right, exactly, And a lot of time, but that is what happens a lot, is in the beginning we're doing something largely to entertain ourselves, and that's fine. That's fine. And then there is the work of the second and third and the fourth draft, and you show it to people and you get critiques, and there's a whole process there, which is about, you know, getting the core, figuring out what the core of that is and what you need to get that across to other minds. And sure, then a lot of the time what I find myself doing is taking out the clever shit. You know what I mean? Like a lot of the time I'm like, it's too often coyness, like a bad habit that I have, that, or not bad, like a thing I do that often disappears in third draft, is like there's a piece of information that I'm, you know, hinting at, not revealing to the reader, or there's a reveal. Like very often you find out that whole like reveal arc is not necessary. You could just let them know from the beginning, or like whenever it comes out. Like, you know what I mean? Like that whole,
I mean, I think that's a question I end up asking in workshop a lot with my students. Like, okay, you kept this secret until this point. What would happen to your story if you put that on the first page and then went from there? And often it's a better story. Not always, right? But often it ends up being a better story.
And I think we're often doing that because we're looking for what the engine of profluence of the plot is going to be. And like one classical kind of plot is a reveal story, in which what the reader is actually reading is like they don't know and then they know. And that's great. And like often, and I find, especially at a very short length, like in terms of the other cities, which a lot of them have no characters and no, like, I don't know, they're like very they're very, very short, and they have to have some profluence, they have to have some payoff, and a lot of them, what's happening is it's a reveal, like it appears to be one thing and then it's another, which at 500 words describing an imaginary city is a very nice structure. But very often if you're writing something longer with people in it, by the time you have written it, there's enough there that the reveal has now become superfluous. Like, it doesn't need to be the engine. There's enough of an engine, even if we did know what was going on.
I would say that I think for me, I still do like often have that reveal structure in my first drafts, and it's almost a sign of lack of confidence in the story, right? You know, like I don't quite trust that there's going to be enough meat there otherwise, so I'll build in this, you know, puzzly reveal thing, and then hopefully if the story goes well, I don't need it anymore, right?
But again, I just want to say, I mean, that framing also sounds like maybe you shouldn't do it, but maybe you should do it. Maybe it's fine to have that lack of confidence, because really you are trying to like find your way into the story, and like having that, like a lot of, like, don't be afraid of scaffolding, I think is part of the takeaway here, is like lots of stuff is in your first draft. You can write lots of stuff to amuse yourself. Your reader never has to see it. The same thing is true of info dumps. Like you like, feel free to go hog wild explaining the whole hell out of your world in the first draft. You don't have to show it to your reader. Like that may end up being, like those 3 pages may end up being 1 sentence in the final draft. Like that's fine. Like, but
that's so interesting. So that I'm never tempted to do. So I think it's, you know, like that just sounds like so much work and tedium. I know some people enjoy it, but I'm like, you know, so it's fascinating. Like you're giving people permission
sometimes
to do
that's also a way of struggling toward what you're trying to say.
It makes sense.
Like sometimes that's stalling. Sometimes I'll write like a bunch of like the world because I don't know what the characters are doing yet. Like that, you know, it's sort of, it's stalling, or it's like stuff that I don't know how to, it's stuff that's crucial for understanding the experience of the characters and I don't yet know how to thread it through. You know what I mean? It's like it's a lump, and later it won't be a lump. Anyway.
All right. Well, we should wrap. I think I've got one line that I'm going to end with, which is something I say a lot in class. If you're bored writing it, the reader will probably be bored reading it. So, and I think that's like that's when I go into revise. That's often what I'm looking for. Before I send a story out, the last step I always do is I read it out loud to do like a final cleanup pass, which I have to say for a novel takes a long time, but I do it because it's so useful. And this is a story that like I know intimately. I usually like let it sit for a few weeks before I do this. And I'm looking to be still caught up in it and still like engaged paragraph by paragraph. If I'm bored reading aloud a section, there's a problem there, right? Like there's something where I haven't done as much with it as I could.
And the corollary, like that's a signal. It doesn't mean that you need to abandon it. It's that. But that's like and why does it get boring there? Why did you shy away from, like sometimes it's like you're afraid of, like Go There was another is that Nalo? One of our Clarion.
Go.
Well, and Hopkinson's motto was Go There.
I'll give one more example that you reminded me of. This is, when we get to the indie publishing thing, we can talk about editors and the utility of them. When I wrote The Stars Change, right, that I wrote as a lark, then turned into a meatier thing than I expected. It got picked up by Cecilia Tan at Circlet Press, which is great. And she read it, and it was, I'd been writing for 15, 20 years at that point. Like, it was a good book. Already it was a good book. But she said, she had a couple, like, minor notes here and there, but she had one critical thing. She's like, the big climax is this dinner party scene, and you kind of skip over it, and you go right from, like, heading up to it to the aftermath to, like, going off and racing off to fight the bad guys. And all of the heart conflict is in that scene, and why didn't you write it? And I was like, well, it's going to be hard to write because I've got a lot of people talking, and so like there's like a laziness to like managing all those voices, but also there's an emotional, like, that's the heart of the book. All my characters have to like work through their stuff, and so
and that's the thing that I know that's so anyway, we're getting away from where to get your ideas and more into third draft stuff, but I find that too, like there's that you shy away from, sometimes from the heart of it, you shy away from the so
okay, maybe that goes in another episode, but so this is great. I think we covered a lot, and hopefully in a way that's useful. So we'll wrap this up, and
that's good.
We'll be back with more.
All right.
For better or worse.